Hello, and welcome to Unwatchables, the film podcast where we do a deep dive into the movies we are most afraid to watch. From punishing art films to extreme horror to everything in between, at the end of each episode, we are going to answer the question, if you could, would you unwatch this? I'm Marc Dottavio.
I'm Seth Troyer.
And our first film is Lars Von Trier's 2009 art film provocation, Antichrist. Let the chaos reign. And we should probably say up front, if these are movies that you haven't seen or anything, as far as spoilers go, I think nothing's going to be off limits as far as what we're talking about. So, take that as a warning. Maybe you want to watch along with us. Maybe it's something you've already seen or something you don't want to see and would rather just hear people talk about.
I mean, hearing people talk about it is always more interesting than seeing the movie, right?
In pretty much every case.
But you should not leave. Don't leave. Just let us spoil everything for you.
You're in good hands. So just for, a little background to start us off here, since the whole idea of this is to kind of put ourselves through it. I know, Seth, you and I have rather similar sensibilities, I think, when it comes to film. We certainly disagree on, certain things. But as far as content, is there anything that you have a particular sensitivity towards? Do you often find yourself having some issues or some particular boundaries? Or is this podcast mainly going to be me tormenting you?
Well, this podcast sort of grew out of you tormenting me in a way. We were watching movies like most people did over the initial phase of the pandemic, just talking about the movies afterwards, and we were just taking turns, and it seemed like one after the other. It would be Marc's turn, and another whopper, Marc. Another not necessarily fun time at the movies, which sometimes I'm ready for that stuff, sometimes I'm not, depending on even how I'm feeling. I definitely am sensitive, in particular, towards violence towards women and sexual violence and things of that nature. Definitely are the things that I am most not even just myself being that puts me off of a movie. I'm going to be very, very critical of the director, and it's going to be I'm going to need to be convinced as to why that needed to be in there, or if they're just doing it to fuck with me or something.
So we could probably agree, that it really depends on how you handle the subject matter, and that the filmmaker has a responsibility, if they're going to go to those places, to not be exploiting it, not be exploiting our reactions as an audience. So I would say there are certain things that no matter how they're handled, I always find myself kind of looking away from the screen. Animal violence is a big one for me, especially the ones that it's clearly real animal violence, of which there may be movies that we get to at some point that even have things like that, because there are some famous examples. And yeah, as far as everything else, I feel like maybe as I've gotten a little bit older and more mature in my movie watching, I actually have gotten a little more squeamish about certain things, or things getting to me, maybe more so than I was as a young, adventurous cinephile, of which I guess I still am. But there's definitely limits that I know I can hit. But it's not often that I will turn off a movie or not, actually get to that point. But we could possibly reach that with some of the ideas we've been talking about here.
You could be phased. It's possible to phase, Marc.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the first thing that we're going to talk about touches on a lot of these things that we have gone over. Kind of the theme of our next few discussions here are going to be about movies that have a kind of artistic pretension to them. In particular, these are films that debuted at the Cannes Film Festival.
Oh, Marc, you peasant. It's pronounced Cannes. Con, like James Caan.
Oh, is it? Oh, I think it's Can like James Can, but we'll have to agree to disagree on that, because I hear Canes, which I really think is wrong too. But
all right, that's going too.
We'll get a French expert in at some point. But either way, however you want to pronounce it, I would say many, if not most, major directors try to premiere their new films at Cannes. And the first director that we're going to be talking about is Lars Von Trier, who is no stranger to the Cannes Film Festival. In fact, I believe Dancer in the Dark in 2001, the Palme d'Or, their top prize there.
Oh, please, Marc. It's pronounced Palme d'Or. I'm just keeping the bit going.
I thought you were going to have a different pronunciation of Dancer in the Dark.
Dancer in the Dark. That won that? I had no idea that won that.
It did. Mm-hmm.
Man, they're crazy. They're so intense, those Cannes people.
I want to say that Bjork even won Best Actress there, but we might need our producer to fact check that. So, but certainly in any case, anytime he has a new movie coming out, it's a big deal. The people at Cannes are going to see it first. They're going to write about the premiere. And this is a director who definitely has a provocative streak in him, I would say.
He's a naughty boy.
Pretty much.
He's a very naughty boy.
There you go.
Hey guys, Tony here. So Bjork did win Best Actress at. I'll pick Cannes since that's the only one left over to use. Also, quick fact check. Marc pronounced it Palme d'Or. I believe it's pronounced hors d'oeuvre.
Oh my god. I hate you both.
This is why we have Tony here. Tony, introduce yourself. You are our floating android assistant who is constantly surfing the net.
I am in the mainframe. I'm on Wikipedia. I'm on IMDb. I've got all that stuff.
Can I just say I'm glad that other people can hear Tony, because I just wasn't this. He's always this just voice in my head. And I wasn't sure if he was real until now, which is why you don't see him.
You'll never see me, and you will hear me only when it's necessary.
Yeah, back in the cage, Tony. Back in the cage.
All right, so good. I'm glad I was right about that, and the pronunciation of the Palme hors d'oeuvre. So when Antichrist came out, it was the new Lars Von Trier movie, and there was a premiere. And if anybody has seen this movie, I mean, you can probably imagine that it got some reactions at the time. I'll go ahead and read here. This is a article from, I want to say it's Reuters. Just somebody reporting from the actual premiere, just to give you an idea of kind of what the atmosphere was there. So this is the article. Danish director Lars Von Trier elicited derisive laughter, gasps of disbelief, a smattering of applause, and loud boos on Sunday as the credits rolled on his drama Antichrist at the Cannes Film Festival. Cannes' notoriously picky critics and press often react audibly to films during screenings, but Sunday evening's viewing was unusually demonstrative. Jeers and laughter broke out during scenes ranging from a talking fox to graphically portrayed sexual mutilation. The reaction suggested that Von Trier, who won the top prize in Cannes with Dancer in the Dark in 2000, could be in for a rough ride from reviewers and journalists on Monday. One U.S. critic said he and others found the film offensive and questioned why it was included in the main competition of 20 films in Cannes.
I think just about every reaction that I just heard talked about there is it totally tracks. There's at least like one scene in here you can boo at, one scene in here you can laugh at, one scene in here that's just going to make you shit your pants. The whole spectrum is in there. And he should expect nothing less. He should have expected nothing less.
Yeah, and let's hope that it's the same moments. And Charlotte Gainsbourg, one of two stars of this movie, along with Willem Dafoe, I believe she did win Best Actress as well for this film. So as far as the jeers and the harsh response, it did get that much recognition, at least, from the jury. And this is nothing else if not a test for actorly commitment in this movie. Let's back up even further and just talk about Lars Von Trier, because he has made a lot of very notable movies, and we recently watched and talked about Breaking the Waves in person, which was kind of, I think, generally considered his first movie that was kind of his fully formed style, that has a lot of the things that would go on to persist through the rest of his movies. And since then, there was Dancer in the Dark, Dogville, Antichrist, and since then, there's been many more too. I mean, why don't you start us off, Seth? What are your general feelings about Von Trier, and what are your favorite and least favorite movies by him? Antichrist accepted.
He frequently again and again, he shows that he can do all things. It seems it's just what he chooses to do is really like the perplexing and sometimes off-putting thing, because he, like in this film is a good example, and in many of his films, he'll go from like the beginning of this movie looks like a slow motion, like beautiful perfume ad that you would see like Johnny Depp in. It's like so hyper artistic, like beautiful film. And then it will go in the next scene to like handheld, shaky, sort of cut up editing, non-linear sort of storytelling, a sort of amateurness, and going in and out of these. I know he began focusing more on the high fidelity end of his skills as when he first started with like Europa and the Element of Crime, and that gave way to this ethos that he helped create, I believe, called Dogma 95, which is it has its own manifesto, its own rules, and multiple filmmakers have followed this dogma that for filmmaking, these instructions for filmmaking. I think they include, I forget what all it includes, but a lot of it is it's to get the director to make choices that they quite often wouldn't make, and to sort of veer their filmmaking away from a conventional Hollywood sort of way of creating film, and create like forcing like over the top situations or something. Hard to describe exactly. I need like all the rules.
There is a list of rules, and I mean, just off the top of my head, I know that there can't be any non-diegetic music, nothing added to the soundtrack. It has to take place in the present day. No artificial lighting. I think that's where a lot of the like handheld camera work and stuff comes from, in particular. So it's very stripped down, basically.
I think they also have like something about like the sex has to be unsimulated.
Ooh,
stuff like that has to be real if you're going to do it.
I mean, that's a rule I have in real life. I don't know about movies.
It's it's all real for Marc.
In real life, I'm like, hang on, is this a special effect?
I heard some of these genitalias are fake in this one, which
Thank God.
is a relief by the end of the movie. Quite often, I start one of his movies thinking, "Oh my God, why don't I watch more of these Lars Von Trier movies? They're like so up my alley." Like, because I'm very interested in like lo-fi approaches to film and like new ways of editing and things like that. Often by the end of the films, I am reminded why I don't watch Lars Von Trier every like Friday night or something, because he is extremely off-putting, and oftentimes almost to an absurd level. He throws at you like horrors and tragedies and intense depictions of violence of various sorts. Breaking the Waves, which we watched, is like a good example of that, which I found even more heartbreaking than this, even though like reading the wiki synopsis of Antichrist is like, holy shit, like I can't believe that would happen in a movie. But Breaking the Waves was almost more disturbing for me because it was even more rooted in like a capital R reality, which involved like that main character like going through hell, like literal hell before our very eyes, after spending, again, the first part of the movie just getting to know her and love her because of how great of a director Lars Von Trier is and what a great movie maker he is. He can make you really care about someone.
And that's kind of the line on him, right? That he's a very, very technically skilled filmmaker, gets very powerful performances, but he gets accused of kind of trying to punish the audience, which could play very differently movie to movie, but he's been accused of, maybe having like a kind of scolding tone or trying to put you through it. Or you could just look at the main characters in his movies, which usually there's one or two like single figures, very oftentimes women, that he puts through the ringer in very extreme ways. Whether it's, Bjork in Dancer in the Dark, or certainly Breaking the Waves, or Dogville, which is probably my favorite of his movies.
It's up there.
Because I think that the whole Dogma 95 thing just kind of shows that he's always he's always thinking very conceptually about things. And so all you have to do is look at Dogville and see that there are no sets. There's just chalk outlines marking this town. And that actually foregrounds the kind of artificiality of everything. And when that works, I think that's like his strength as a filmmaker. And my second favorite, which would be Breaking the Waves, like isn't quite as conceptual as that, and really is connected to this like very like painfully human performance from Emily Watson in the middle of it all. But generally, it's not so much about like dramatic nuance and humanity. There's always something going on that he has kind of an agenda with, which can be very exhilarating, I think, when it works. And then at other times, it might verge into trolling for me sometimes. But his best movies, the ones that I like the most, I think are kind of uniquely powerful in that way.
And all of this is very much dancing around Antichrist. I keep on because it is such a specific example of all of what we're talking about.
Yes. And this movie, I would say it certainly reaches a point where it seems like it starts to become about like, all right, we're in the inner circle of hell, and we're going to see what you and everybody else in this movie can possibly tolerate.
Yeah. At least when it came out, it was the climax of all of the things we're talking about, I think, as far as just Trier being punishing in more ways than one. And also, I'm glad you brought up one of the big contentions and questions is his relationship to women in movies, which is very important to this film in many ways, and is always sort of an amorphous question with a lot of critics. Is like he seems to have a real interest in women, and he develops very strong, very developed, realistic women characters. But like you said, they're often put through absolute hell. Question is, walking out, like, what was that all about? Here?
Right. Was it worth it? And I mean, you brought up, in particular, sexual violence against women. And, those things are in full force in this movie. But in most of his movies, there are heinous things that happen to the women that is often sexual. And this movie might be a little more equal opportunity as far as the suffering goes, but it does discuss women in particular in a way. So maybe that's a good way to kind of start diving into this. Although my first question is, when you first start watching this movie, would you consider this a horror movie?
Yeah. It's a movie that mutates. It begins as, again, a horrific perfume commercial. Beautiful, high fidelity. And then it feels like it's some sort of Ingmar Bergman film, which like almost goes to like an unbearable, almost like a navel-gazy sort of feeling. And then it does slowly goes from art film to straight up, feels like Saw at the end almost, or something like that, which is simplifying it a bit, but it is, I don't know, there's a lot to be said about how this does feel in a lot of ways like a traditional like man-woman goes out to the woods and very Freudian horror things happen, a la like fucking even something as primitive as like Friday the 13th or Evil Dead is totally something comparable to what happens.
I was totally thinking about the Evil Dead when the way they venture out into the woods, the way that the nature itself seems to be scheming against them, and a little bit of The Shining as far as the relationship dynamic and the one person kind of losing their mind at a certain point. But that doesn't really describe what this movie is like.
No. So plot-wise, where do we begin?
Yeah, please. Let's start with...
So the perfume commercial.
Yeah, and I'm trying to wonder what Lars Von Trier's scent would be called. Like, I'm thinking maybe just Pain, Grief, Despair.
Yeah.
Could maybe be the title.
Dead Baby.
Right. Gynocide by Von Trier.
Yes.
But basically, it's pretty simple. There's really only two characters, a husband and wife, played by Charlotte Gainsbourg and Willem Dafoe. They don't even have names. They're just listed as, I believe, he and she. And after the accidental death of their child, their small child, the wife goes into a very serious depression and despair. And her husband, who happens to be a therapist, decides that he is going to be her grief therapist and get her through all of this because nobody knows better than him. And that is by going to their cabin in the woods, where she once spent a summer working on her thesis alone with the child. And the cabin is called Eden. So right from the beginning, we have he and she are venturing out to Eden.
The movie is called Antichrist, and you have to wonder, like, why, as this goes along. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this is, many ways, this is a capital A art film, especially when it starts out. All right. You talked about the beginning that is set to an opera. It's in black and white and is in such slow motion. It's almost like a tableau where things almost aren't even moving at all.
Yes. Which he repeats throughout his filmography, I believe, after this consistently.
You're right. I think it started with this.
With, I think, Melancholia, and I forget what else, but at least in Melancholia, there's also these, like, where you, for a second, you think it's a photograph, and then the arm slowly is moving, you see, and there is movement. But yeah, the opening, it's so, like, over the top, like, dramatic with the opera. One does, though, see it in the context of the rest of the film as this, like, it's made to be so profound because it is the catalyst. It is the thing that the rest of the movie is just constantly referencing or trying to dodge around, right? Is this prologue that involves he and she fucking in slow motion, very passionately all over the house as their little child slowly walks past them without them noticing. And ever so slowly balances on a window and ever so slowly falls out of the window.
The wide open window during a snowstorm, as one will often have.
Yep. Seemingly during the climax of his parents' sexual entanglement. Capital A, art film.
Yeah, there's a definite juxtaposition between this baby on its way to death and their carnal pleasure with each other. And by the time that the baby's making its way towards its window and it passes these three figurines that are labeled pain, grief, and despair.
I'll tell you what, I did not see that. Okay, wow.
Oh, really? I mean, I have figurines like that. I figured most people do. I keep them by the open window during the snowstorm while the baby's in its crib.
It's important for the rest of the movie, folks. It is.
It is. The rest of the chapters actually then take their titles, or at least three of them do: grief, pain, and despair. So there's strenuous symbolism going on here as a whole for this movie, but particularly in the beginning. I guess you got to see the rest of it to kind of know what to do with that, why he's juxtaposing this, but it does set the tone, and it does very much leave behind any idea of this Dogma 95, like, kind of rules. This could not be more stylized. And not that he ever really went that strictly by the rules. I mean, as soon as he made them, he was already breaking them in Breaking the Waves, which also has these little, like, interstitial images or tableaus with music playing over them. But I think you're right. This is where that started. Like, ever since Antichrist, it's been kind of going back and forth between these extremely, like, ornate, stylized images and music. And then we kind of go back to the handheld camera, and I think one of his trademarks is his editing, which is basically has no regard for continuity. It'll cut off in the middle of people's lines and skip right to their next line, or maybe they're facing a different direction, which, kind of gives it a documentary kind of feel.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like, we're never sure, like, what a cut means. Like, possibly they've been talking for 10 minutes, but possibly if we've just cut to an hour later of them, like, having this discussion, and it's left sort of to us to fill in the gaps as to, like, maybe what happens between cuts and stuff, which I find very interesting. But that style is implemented after this prologue, which I find to be very effective in this movie in particular, because it suddenly goes from hyper like majestic, fantastical, real, like, not realism, to, like, a stark realism with this handheld lower fi feeling approach, which is what's going on, which is, like, now we're going into the grief process with these two characters who have just lost their son, and the woman character who is clearly having, like, almost a borderline paranormal reaction to the grief process. Like her grief process is unnatural, she says. There's something going on with her.
Atypical grief pattern.
Right. So it really hammers home that reality. And I do think that makes the prologue so powerful because the way I interpret it is that like that slow motion is important because it's how these characters, or at least Charlotte Gainsbourg's character, views that moment, which is like she goes over every tiny detail of that 2 minutes of her life every day now, which like she constantly is bringing up like, I should have known this. I shouldn't have left the door open. I shouldn't, I should have been watching for him or whatever, which is totally what you would do. So it's just devastating in that way and true to life in that way, I think.
It quickly becomes clear, too, even though, I mean, we do see he, played by Willem Dafoe, kind of sobbing at the funeral right afterwards. But after that point, you don't really get much from him as far as anything that he's going through, because as we learn, he is a therapist, not a doctor, can't prescribe medication, but he wants to step in and become his own wife's like one-on-one grief therapist, which is kind of a fascinating dynamic to see that play out because it's so fucked up and so without like boundaries and just a terrible idea. And, she keeps telling him that he thinks that he is smarter than everyone else. He has her, pour her pills into the toilet and starts just doing all of these just glib exercises with charts and a pyramid and what you're afraid of. And this guy should have his license taken away, I think.
Absolutely. One of the big things is like it's very tragic because we're seeing this character, the woman who is clearly like she's totally inhibited. She is in a lot of ways powerless against this guy who is like clearly over the grieving process, almost like in a sinisterly, like he's out of it so quickly. He seems just like very much over it and like more just throwing himself into the idea of getting her well, more interested in that than him like having any sort of real reaction to his son's death. But she, from the get-go, is not necessarily for it. And if anything, like this is his first sin that she is sort of like allowing him to commit. She's like indulging him in a way, like when she pours her pills down the toilet at it is at his instruction. But as you go along, you see that there's more to her, which is very much up for debate as to what is to her. But there is something you can already start seeing here, even in her most powerless moments, that she's indulging this kind of fucked up situation and letting him kind of make the wrong decision.
Yeah, and I think, maybe my favorite thing about the movie is kind of those parts because it does establish such a bizarre, just dysfunctional dynamic between them that I find pretty interesting. Even when he gets down into this, handheld immediacy and realism and everything, there's still a sense to me that these characters are still being very symbolic about something, that there's a real like conversation here, points that he's making about psychiatry in general through Willem Dafoe. I don't know. This might take us a little further past the scope of where we are at this point, but I think it's important to point out that Lars Von Trier pretty openly and famously has gone through really, really serious bouts of like clinical depression, like being hospitalized for it. And I know in the years leading up to Antichrist, he had even made comments, that he may never be able to work and make another movie again. Just knowing that really kind of snaps this whole movie into focus for me, that it is very much him dealing with depression and what that's like. And I can't help but think like him kind of lashing out at his own therapists or psychiatrists as being overly rational and unhelpful. As much as I want to say that this is like about grief, I think that her just like almost like catatonic depression afterwards is really more of the topic. Because even as we get on further down the road, we kind of discover that her little breakdown has already been happening prior to the child dying. That there was weird stuff going out there in the woods and ideas that she was getting. And there's even a suggestion there at the end, spoiler alert, it does flash back to the little tableau at the beginning of the little kid walking by them having sex. And it seems to, it definitely shows her looking at the kid approaching the window and then just continuing on with her orgasm.
Yes.
Which is a choice.
Which, as things go on, things become more apparent as far as that is concerned. Yet, never fully apparent.
Maybe she was like, hey, don't step on my pain, grief, and despair action figures.
Yeah, listen.
But
but it totally reads as, and it has been interpreted as a mental breakdown on film, and I kind of see it for sure. A lot of his films feel that way. And a lot of art is often sold that way, like, oh, this was their dark night of the soul or something. But when it comes to Trier, it's like in your face. It's very obvious that the person on the other end of this camera has an illness, has a lot going on, has a lot of hang-ups.
Yeah, and when they do get out into the woods finally, because he decides that she needs exposure therapy to this particular place that she is afraid to go back to for some reason. It's not where the kid died or anything.
Even though she always wanted to go there. He says, you always were the one who wanted to go to the woods, to this cabin called Eden that we used to go to, where you used to work on your thesis. And we find out that, no, she insists that's what she's most afraid of. Which you can already see here, this sort of like very classic horror trap going on, where like the character who thinks they have the answers is being led into the woods to something awful.
Absolutely. And as soon as they get there, the little woodland critters in this particular forest, these aren't like the foxes and birds in Snow White, like helping her clean out the cabin.
But it totally comes to mind, though.
Right?
Yeah, but it's a fucked up version of Snow White. Yeah.
And it's immediately Willem Dafoe sees this deer and the camera like turns and it looks like it's giving birth. It's a very kind of just grotesque slow motion image.
Yeah, it's walking around with like a half-eaten fetus coming out of its butt.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, and at every turn, it seems like she was making a little bit of progress during one of the stupid exercises that he makes her do, and then all of a sudden, a fucking baby bird drops out of the sky covered in flies, and another bird comes and eats it.
It's horrifying, and like you can write an easy paragraph of symbols going into something like that. Absurd, like dark art film shit.
And I see that as Von Trier basically is showing like what beautiful nature would look like to somebody who is like majorly intensely depressed, right? Everything is ugly and depraved and murderous. And that's kind of the point of view that she starts to argue for, that nature and thus mankind itself is evil, that nature is, quote, Satan's church, which I just mainly read as, somebody who has heavy clinical depression, that this is how they're going to see everything, that everything is meaningless and ugly, and nature is just about the smaller things being eaten by the larger things. Very nihilistic in that way.
And tracks back to, again, talking about symbolism here, which is very easily seen of like, it's becoming starker and starker. The male who is in the situation, who is like the traditional male presence, which is rational. We are going to do an exercise to get through this, to fix this, to go on, to do the task. Beating nature, like trying to fight nature and breaking nature. Whereas Charlotte is like in many ways a traditional, throughout history, traditional feminine presence, is more natural, like sort of bending to the ways of nature and immersing oneself in one's feelings and immersing oneself in instinct and things like that. And the whole Satan's church thing is very old, like cult stuff, right? Like old English great god Pan. I read a lot of Lovecraft and Arthur Machen, like weird fiction, and that came to mind for me, of this like the way early Europeans viewed the woods as still like this place where there is sort of like beauty and there's also danger because it's where we come from or something. Under the rule of spirits we don't understand, all of that, which, you know, tracks in almost all societies, right?
Definitely. And I mean, I really don't want to undersell like how over the top this gets with that stuff. I mean, probably the most famous moment from this movie is when he comes across a fox outside that is just, it's just matted. And if you like foxes, this is the least cute fox that you've ever seen.
It's pulling itself apart.
Yeah, I guess that is what it's doing. And it just turns its head and looks right at Willem Dafoe and speaks, "Chaos reigns." And then fade to black to the next chapter. And I can only imagine the like jeers in the theater when that was happening.
And yeah, the audience is, it's something so absurd. What do you do with that? Yeah, what am I supposed to do with that? It's also terrifying.
Yeah, there's a level of ridiculousness to this movie that seemed really pronounced to me this time.
I watched a commentary on Criterion Channel with him, and he does talk about the fox scene. In that scene, he did talk about how he saw it as a humorous, partially a humorous, absurdist level to it. This is from Trier's Truth, which is looking around and seeing everything telling him that chaos reigns.
I just want to interject really briefly to mention that since 2001, Cannes has given out an award called the Palm Dog for the best canine performance at the festival that year. And the Talking Fox was nominated for the Palm Dog the year that Antichrist came out, but unfortunately it lost to Doug, the dog from Up.
Oh my God. And you think this is a Tony joke, but it's not.
This is real. This is one of my favorite pieces of trivia about this movie.
That's so insane.
I mean, probably the fox and the dog had the same agent, so either way.
Yeah.
There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff as far as awards go, so who knows what kind of favors they pulled for that dog.
It's fixed.
But, oh God, the Palm Dog. I guess a bit of a stretch. He has a fox.
Yeah. Dogs being fixed, that's a fine transition back into the plot.
Oh, yeah. Well, sure. Let's dive into it. First of all, we talked about how Von Trier frequently gets accused of misogyny in his films. And he seems to invite that kind of idea in the way that he has Charlotte Gainsbourg. As she's researching her thesis, it's found that she kind of starts losing her mind and becomes convinced that women have been attacked throughout history and burned at the stake as witches because they are fundamentally evil, which he says is preposterous and kind of takes a rational view of it. But as the movie unfolds, it seems, as far as I can tell, to kind of confirm that, as far as she takes this turn and starts attacking Willem Dafoe and putting him through all kinds of horrific abuse.
It's also revealed that she tortured their kid, basically, in the past by making him wear 2 left shoes.
Which apparently deformed his feet.
Only after we see that she's getting better, quote unquote, rather suddenly. Like after a few days, apparently, of being in the woods, she has this moment of like, I'm cured. I'm feeling better. And if anything, Willem is like going the opposite way, which is he's getting freaked out by everything that he's seeing around him. And he eventually finds these books of her thesis that she had been working on. And it's like you mentioned The Shining earlier. It's literally ripped from The Shining. He goes through her book that she's been writing, and it goes from like research into violence against women and witchcraft and whatnot. And slowly the pages get scribblier and scribblier until they are unrecognizable. And oh shit, she's fucking insane.
Yeah, it's essentially her all work and no genital mutilation makes Jack a dull boy.
Jill?
Jill, there you go.
Jill, a dull girl. Yeah.
Yes. And it pretty much goes on from there. It's not like she's proven wrong. And they are in Eden, right? So their names are distilled down to their gender. It's he and she. And the biblical Garden of Eden story, I mean, essentially boils down to, man, these pesky women, if they just hadn't have caused this original sin, for us, everything would still be fine. And really the main hesitation that I have about buying into that reading, as blatant as it seems to be, is that I very much read this movie as Von Trier is Charlotte Gainsbourg's character in this. So singling her out as a woman, it's kind of a weird approach to take as far as her own perspective and all the symbolism and everything. But she seems so closely linked to who Von Trier's sympathies are with. And, jumping off of that whole depressive worldview, if you just swap in womankind for mankind, that all of it, humanity, nature, is just evil and depraved. That reading makes more sense to me as a whole as how this movie registers. But that stuff is there. And it's to the point where his last movie was The House That Jack Built. And the entire last act is literally Von Trier, I believe him actually speaking in the movie, is addressing his own motives and accusations of misogyny, which is also kind of where that movie torpedoes for me.
Yeah, I'm not ready for that one right now.
So I don't know. How did that angle strike you?
Well, it was one of the big concerns that I had read about with this movie. I think it's pretty similar to how Breaking the Waves works. This goes more into full-on depression, suicidal, self-hatred to me from what I see here. Because I am of the camp where he is seeing himself, for better or worse, as Charlotte Gainsbourg character. And quite often, his characters that he identifies with are these women characters who are built up or explored in the first act and then explode in a horrible way by the end, which I read this one as more of a self-hatred, where you embrace all the thoughts that you were trying to keep at bay about life or about yourself, right? Which in this instance is the example is what Charlotte believed about women, that she, from what it sounds like, she began as a feminist studies, exploring the injustices against women. And obviously what she is studying and trying to rationalize is this well, of course it's wrong that this ever happened to women at the hands of men. But where does that track after a while into the world of true self-hatred and despair? It leads to you believing the opposite, which is no, there was good reason, because I hate myself. My kind is wrong. My kind is worthy of punishment, and we are evil, which again tracks, I think, with a more despairing, suicidal person who is once they have lost a lot of hope, you don't care about preserving some sort of persona anymore. You see it as a facade. I think that's more of what's going on here, and what happens in a lot of his movies, I think, in the third act.
Yes, and even though this is the perspective of Charlotte's character, but it does seem to be the perspective of the movie overall to me. I don't think that it challenges that. I think it lands in a place where Von Trier is just dropping it in our laps and being yeah, this is what the world is like. This is how I see it, and fade to black. I keep thinking now about his movie after this, which is Melancholia, and also deals explicitly with depression. I think in a more kind of thoughtful, complex way than this movie does, as far as, it has the whole conceit that the world is about to end and everybody knows it. And it has these kind of opposite effects on these two sisters. One is clinically suicidally depressed and knowing that the world is about to explode. It starts actually bringing her this kind of peace. And whereas her healthier, more well-adjusted sister is the one who starts to break down, knowing that the end is near, which is kind of, I think, a little more of an interesting way into addressing that as far as comparing, perspectives and everything. It's interesting that he did these two movies back to back, where this is just the full-on nightmare that he had to get out of his system before moving on to kind of tackling it from a different angle.
I agree. They wind up in similar places. of like, obviously the person who despairs sort of sees the end as a relief rather than a thing to grimace about.
Sure.
If anything, even at its worst parts, which we are about to talk about, the famous, like, you want to just read the wiki synopsis of the last little bit of this movie is outrageous shit. Even throughout it, it almost seems like that is the release. There's a gleefulness in this sort of like all hell breaking loose. Fucking finally, like we can just blow our brains out and go nuts. And like none of this suffering through therapy and the pain of trying to heal oneself. Now it's just about like immolation, basically.
Yeah, we've been dancing around that a little bit now, but there's a certain point here where Charlotte goes full Jack Torrance in The Shining, and a switch flips, and she starts attacking Willem and herself eventually
during sex.
Yeah, and this is the unwatchable territory here. So starts off with them, I guess, kind of embracing, and then she starts attacking him and throws like a log or something at his crotch. And then we just get that just beautiful romantic moment where she gives him oral pleasure while he's unconscious and injured, and we get a nice blood-soaked cum shot, for lack of a better word.
You said it, I didn't.
Sorry. From now on, I'm going to... this is what we're going to use Tony for, to just come in and describe exactly what it is that we see. At that point, it's like, oh, come on.
Yes.
It's really rubbing our faces in it.
Oh, literally.
Yeah.
and that's not the end. That's not the end at all.
No. I mean, we get a little she puts this big screw like through his leg that weights him down.
Puts a screw and a large wheel.
Yes.
All of these are like garden tools that they set up in earlier acts of the movie in a very slasher movie way, right? Oftentimes the credits of like a slasher movie, they will like show the shower where like someone will get killed, and they'll show a scene of the harmless looking shovel that's just in the corner that will in the third act be used to bludgeon somebody, you know.
Yeah, Chekhov's rusty scissors, you could say.
Yep, they go off.
But so for a while then the movie turns into kind of like a conventional, cat and mouse like thriller where he's just like hiding from the crazy lady with the weapons and a shovel, and it's suspenseful.
It's like if Saw was a traditional thriller.
Exactly. Bergman does Saw. And the genital mutilation does not stop there. Going back to our original thesis here, I mean, how were you reacting to those parts? Did you have to look away from the screen? Were you ever thinking like, oh, this is just, I mean, especially that last moment with the scissors, that's really the one that is hard for me to keep my eyes on the screen during.
Oh yeah, I didn't. And you'll find throughout this series that I'm not afraid. If that was a film moment where I was not afraid to be afraid. And I looked away. I don't need it. That was one of the unwatchable moments. TM.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Where she cuts her clitoris off.
And in full close up, when you looked away, the camera did not. It is anatomical in its detail.
As far as my reaction goes, though, I had a particular experience with this because I read the wiki synopsis, and I don't think I'm alone in that. I've run into a lot of people who have not seen the movie but know about this third act, which I'm curious if you had the knowledge or not, because that colored the entire viewing experience for me.
So this isn't the first time that I've seen this movie. I saw this, I want to say like 7 or 8 years ago, probably. So it wasn't fresh in my mind, but that's not the kind of thing you really forget. But I can say the first time that I saw this movie, I did not know anything that was coming. And that was a bad pun. Sorry.
Fired.
We're going to cut that out.
We'll fix that in post.
Please, Tony.
And I was not prepared and not even like sure if I was going to have to look away. So I probably still saw it and was just like, oh yeah, no cutaway here. And I did know it was coming this time, did kind of do a little peripheral vision, kind of looking away to know when it was over, because who needs that? Who needs to see that?
But it is interesting, isn't it, though, that I think we both are big horror fans, and like there's so many movies that are drenched in blood, drenched in like full-on amputations of all sorts. But this movie doesn't have a ton of that stuff. It's just in this like last 5 minutes here. And isn't it interesting that it's because it's genital based? Like that is like what makes this way higher on the list than like Saw, which has a way higher body count and in a lot of ways like grosser stuff on paper maybe, but like where we are, of course, like sexual genital type mutilation type stuff is like that's going to hit us hard because of course that's our pleasure centers, that's a source of our personal identities, and obviously the identities of like these characters, which like are very tied to gender ideas, right? Of being he and her, and it ending in the destruction of, at least in this very old world binary way, of their he and her parts, right? He's had enough of it, does away with it all. And so this is the whole like last like act of the movie, from her first attacking him to mutilating herself to one of the nastier strangulations I think that I've seen in a movie too, when he does eventually kill her. Which I didn't see that coming, actually. That was rough. I did still see him as a rational being, which, okay, again, what does that mean? Like this male rationality. This probably leads to some sort of like vengeance, sort of, which I still saw him as like more of like at least what he pretended to be, right? Which was like a therapist of some sort who is like seeing through this as psychosis, and she can't help herself. She's doing things that she does not mean to me. And I was waiting for him to like finally get the thing off his leg and just like run and get help. She needs help, right? He does not do that. He turns his wrath on her and loses his rationality.
And frankly, it's like, in my next therapist appointment, if I pull any of that, I give them permission, I think, ahead of time to strangle me if they have to, because we all have our boundaries.
If I'm being that naughty,
yeah, and so that's the whole like that's the end point of this movie. That all happens. He kills her. He wanders out into the woods, and there's a little epilogue where, there's earlier parts in the movie, like there's some point they're having sex by a tree and you see all these like arms that are coming out of the ground. There's this kind of surreal imagery there, which, you could take literally or not. We already have had a talking fox at this point.
There's a lot of talk of witches in her research, that she's talking about witches and how they could use magic and call things into being. And it seems to be, he like eventually like burns her body at the stake at the end, right? Like a witch, in this place where there's like a visual flourish that looks like referencing the many burnings and killings of these witches throughout time, right? And like basically communicating that she's one of these. Like that's at least one way of looking at this, that she was like, again, like in a traditional horror movie, she was a witch the whole time, and she was bringing her prey into the woods to devour him, basically. And
the context historically of witch burnings, it is about controlling and violence against women who, spoiler alert, none of them are actually witches. So that combined with all of the Eden symbolism, this does seem very much to be like, oh, but yeah, what if all of this violence and control against women, they actually were evil ass witches. And it really seems to be like all of this movie has to say on the matter is it's just kind of dramatizing that. And then he is the one who wanders away, and then all of a sudden there's a huge like army of people following him, all with their faces blurred.
Specifically women, I think.
I didn't notice that. You could be right.
It is all women.
That's what I found so puzzling. And like, what does it mean at like the end? It has a feeling of weird redemption, and I don't really know how that lines up with this. I'm not sure what to do with Willem Dafoe suddenly being faced with. They don't even seem like witches, right? Like I thought they were, maybe at first they were like an army of witches, like from the dead, like rising or something. But they have their faces blurred out, and they look to be like modern looking, plainly dressed women walking through the woods, like dozens of them. And Willem Dafoe just looks on, and the film ends.
It sure does. I don't know. There's I got kind of like a Chosen People vibe just to go along with all of the like Christian imagery and the way that he's like leading them through the woods. I really don't know.
I guess I don't necessarily see Trier landing on some sort of hard-nosed idea at the end of this film, like some people would say, that it is specifically stating that women are evil or something, like that there is an inherent evil nature to the feminine. I don't know. Do you think it sort of lands on that like Trier is trying to make this outrageous statement that like women have evil nature in them for being women?
I think he's trying to push buttons. I kind of had this feeling about the movie as a whole is that I can't really say I liked it. It's fascinating, but it's so over the top, and it really just kind of gives me this feeling of kind of like just nose thumbing at the audience, maybe in the way that he does get accused of sometimes, but I don't always agree with. But this really does seem like he's opening up the can and being like, all right, you would see like how far now this is going to go down to the dark rabbit hole of his mind, and very much like him, like he is, working through something. But I'm not sure this movie really does have a whole lot to say beyond presenting this nightmare vision of a depressive's world. It doesn't have the most nuanced view of, psychotherapy or psychiatry. You could look at this as like kind of an anti psychiatry film, even though Willem Dafoe is bad, like he is a bad one. What he's doing would not be approved. But I do get the sense that Von Trier just kind of lumps them all together, and that is kind of how he sees everything. Like, what do you know? You don't know the darkness that's really out there. Your rationality cannot wrap around it. And the whole like end point of this movie is kind of just rubbing our faces in it at that point in a way that is frequently very silly.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does, if you could call it a failure, it does fail in the sense of traditionally having some sort of actual thing to say. And I think that's the only reason I would disagree with a hard-nosed sort of, he's actually believes some of the crazy shit that's going on in here. Or like, again, like I said before, that like this is I think this is like closer to Babel. Like this is closer to free association. Yeah, like someone writing down their dreams and their dark fantasies.
Yeah. And it's, am I going to get something out of it? Is it worth, the audience sitting through? That's up to you, I guess.
Yeah, it depends on how much of a glutton you are for this sort of like weirdness. Yeah, if you want to read someone's like fucked up diary of like one of the worst psychotic breaks they had, like that is, undeniably like morbidly fascinating, and it's like hard to not want to like open that book. But like that's basically like what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and if this is just a indulgent failure of a kind, it's a spectacular failure. Like it swings for the fences, and you will never forget it. And I probably, if I was watching this at Cannes amid all of the other like quiet, stodgy art films, I would probably get a kick out of it on some level of putting everyone in that theater through this.
Absolutely.
So I sympathize with that. Oh, speaking of the ending, this is a time to bring this up, okay? Because I got a huge laugh out of this movie. We're at the ending. We've had a solid half hour of genital mutilation, talking animal corpses, blood in the ejaculate. It fades to black, and the first thing we see is dedicated to Andrei Tarkovsky. And I'm like, not since like Hinckley shot Reagan has there been like a less flattering tribute to a cinematic luminary. I feel like Tarkovsky was like, bro, but we're good. You don't have to put my name as the first thing that people see after this. Like, oh, what a lovely tribute.
It's a real weird choice. Yeah.
Apparently that little caption got some boos at Cannes too. It just, yeah, I had a good laugh when that being the first thing that comes up on screen.
Another fun fact I found out about this, that they're apparently going to make a video game.
Oh, I read that too. I can only imagine.
And he was, of course, like talking about how it would be a place for someone to express the most darkest ideas. You know, is everybody really enjoying my Lars Von Trier?
I don't want it to stop.
Really labored over it. But yeah, he was like talking about how like this will be like you can go in there and do your darkest biddings and stuff. And I'm just like, I can't even imagine like him trying to advise someone who makes games and them just being like, you can't do that. It's not how it works. It wouldn't be like, what are you talking about?
Interestingly, the game was supposed to pick up right where the film ended, which of all places, what is that? What does that set up for the game?
The most puzzling part of the entire movie, the ending. I'm imagining Willem Dafoe just running around and like karate chopping witches in the woods.
Oh yeah, and you got to find the scissors. You can upgrade the scissors.
Yeah.
Apparently, this only never happened because Zentropa Games, the production company that was slated to release this thing, went out of business 2 years after they picked up the project.
That's crazy. Zentropa Games. Zentropa is Lars Von Trier's production company.
Right.
That means they had a wing that was devoted to making video games. I got to figure out if they made any video games.
I can't wait to get to like the Dogville one where you just walk around just a black background with chalk marks on the ground. And there's no real weapons or anything, but you just kind of pretend that there's props there. Well, hopefully somebody will pick up on that today, because I'm not sure if I'll ever be watching Antichrist again, but I would absolutely play the video game. Well, this, I think, brings us to the point here then to kind of ask our concluding question here. Was there anything so bad about this movie that you do wish that you could unwatch it?
Well, again, I looked away during certain mutilation shots. Really, though, the thing about it is that it's not as disturbing to me as other Trier films, again, as something like Breaking the Waves was to me, because Antichrist exists in such a over-the-top version of reality. So not that anyone could ever see the third act coming to such a crazy place, but to me, I felt that it was just I was less sympathetic and less like distraught by it, because it was so symbolic and existing in the world of like closer to metaphor and like the fantastical.
Yeah, I agree. I think his other, frankly, better movies, I think, are more emotionally traumatizing, and this one is mainly a visceral kind of ordeal that you have to go through.
Which I would say I think I'm closer to watching this one before you would because of that. I find the emotional traumatizing thing to be, I guess now that I think about it, to be the thing that actually puts me off and makes me not want to come back to a movie. As much as definitely something like genital mutilation absolutely puts me off of a movie. I'm not going to go out of my way to see this again, of course.
Sometimes he just wants to mutilate the genitals of your heart.
Indeed.
Yeah, so I agree. I'm happy that I have seen this and gone through it, and I don't, feel like a lesser person coming out of it. I would be very, very careful who I recommend it to. I probably won't be handing out like the Blu-rays around Christmas time. But then again, I wouldn't either for Dogville or Breaking the Waves, which are very, very powerful in their own right, and the actors do what they can here with this. I think obviously they're like fully committed, and apparently there were some awards that went out and things. And I can't fault them at all for trying to make something like human that makes sense out of all of the symbolism and and portent and the whole Von Trier-ness of it all. But they don't get a terrible lot to work with. I don't think it gives them enough to give like a great performance, but they certainly do the best possible work they could.
Yes. I mean, the last thing I'll say on that note is sort of like, I enjoy this film in the way that I enjoy something like Daniel Johnston or Neutral Milk Hotel or various musicians and albums that are made like under duress of like mental and emotional breakdown, which are undeniably interesting, which, you know, Daniel Johnston is a famously like, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and various issues of that sort, but like has a whole discography of music. And it's, of course, very interesting to go in and hear that perspective. And you can like kind of get a window into this world, but it's important to, you know, remember what's going on and remember how like kind of tragic a lot of it is that like, you know, this person is going through this like Trier is, which is, you know, not necessarily schizophrenia, but a breakdown of some kind.
Well, one day we'll get his peaceful, nostalgic period piece about growing up in the Netherlands or wherever he grew up, and there will be a warm-hearted Lars Von Trier film yet.
It'll be called Naughty Boy.
Unwatchables is produced by Tony Scarpitti. Hosted by me, Marc Dottavio, and Seth Troyer, with artwork by Micah Kraus. You can find Seth and I on Letterboxd under Marc Dottavio and Sloth Troyer. You can also check us out at unwatchablespod.com for links to our Twitter and Instagram, or support us on Patreon for bonus content and to have a say in what we watch. Thanks for listening.